Paris, 1307. It's still dark when the silence of the city is shattered by violent pounding on doors. Not one house. Not two. Dozens, hundreds. The king's soldiers advance through narrow streets, carrying sealed orders that cannot be opened until that exact moment. Everything has been planned with precision. Everything happens at the same time. And before the sun rises, one of the most powerful organizations in the world simply ceases to exist. Influential men are dragged from their beds, accused of crimes no one had ever heard of before. There is no immediate trial. No clear explanation. Only mass arrests, silence, and fear. But the strangest thing of all is not the fall of the Knights Templar. It's the reason. Because to this day, no one can fully explain what really happened that night. What if the history you know is incomplete? Stay with me until the end, because the more you understand this case, the more it leaves questions unanswered. To understand what happened in Paris that early morning, you need to go back almost 2 centuries, to a moment when the world was completely different. Not just politically. Mentally. Spiritually. The medieval world was governed by a logic that seems distant today, but that at the time defined everything: who you were, how much you were worth, what you could do and what you could never question. In that context, religion was not merely a belief. It was the structure that held society together. And the Crusades were the ultimate expression of that structure. Holy wars. Military campaigns justified by faith, financed by kings and blessed by the church. The declared goal was to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim hands and ensure that Christian pilgrims could make their journeys in peace. But the road to Jerusalem was long. Dangerous. Full of paths dominated by thieves, mercenaries and groups that preyed on the vulnerability of travelers. Pilgrims set out on those roads carrying their life savings close to their bodies, praying they wouldn't be attacked before reaching their destination. Most didn't arrive with what they had brought. Many didn't arrive at all. It was in that scenario that the Knights Templar emerged. At first, they were just a group of 9 knights. 9 men with a mission that seemed modest against the chaos of the era: to protect the pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. No grandeur. No structure. No resources. Nothing suggested they would become one of the most influential organizations in medieval Europe. But that is exactly what happened. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem offered the group a place to settle within the ruins of what was believed to be the ancient Temple of Solomon. That is where the name came from. Knights of the Temple. Templars. And it was from there, from that place laden with religious and historical symbolism, that everything began to grow. In the early years, they were so poor they shared horses between themselves. There was a famous symbol of that era: 2 knights riding the same animal, representing the poverty and brotherhood of the order. It was an image that conveyed humility. And that humility, paradoxically, was what gave them credibility. People began to trust them. Not out of fear. Out of respect. With time, they not only earned respect on the battlefield, but also gained something even more powerful: trust. Kings, nobles and even religious leaders began to trust them to protect not just people, but wealth. And that is where everything changed. The Church took a decisive step when Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull called Omni Datum Optimum in 1139. That document transformed the Templars from a respected military order into something far more powerful. With it, they were exempt from taxes in any kingdom in Europe. They could cross borders freely. They answered to no king, no bishop, no feudal lord. Only to the Pope. In a world where hierarchy was everything, that was extraordinary. It was an autonomy that no other lay organization possessed. And with autonomy came resources. The Templars created something that, for the era, was revolutionary. A system that today we would recognize as a primitive form of banking. The idea was simple, but the impact was enormous. A pilgrim who wanted to travel to Jerusalem faced a serious practical problem: how to carry enough money for the journey without becoming an easy target. Gold was heavy. It attracted thieves. Any attack along the way could mean the complete ruin of a family. The Templars offered a solution. The pilgrim would deposit his money at a Templar house before departing. In return, he received a document, a kind of letter of credit with codes and markings that only the Templars knew how to read. Upon arriving in another city, he would present that document at another house of the order and receive the corresponding value. No need to carry gold. No risk of losing everything in an ambush. That sounds simple today. But in the 12th century, it was an innovation that completely changed the way people thought about money and financial security. It was the foundation of what we would later call the banking system. And the system grew far beyond what anyone could have predicted. The Templars began financing kings. They lent money for military campaigns, for the construction of castles, to cover the debts of nobles who needed quick liquidity. And, like any creditor, they charged for the trust they offered. Not necessarily explicit interest, that would have been forbidden by the church, but fees, commissions, agreements that in practice worked the same way. They accumulated wealth, properties, influence. Castles, lands, full coffers. Before long, they were not just warriors. They were an economic power. And like every power, they began to create friction. To grasp the scale, at the height of their power, the Templars owned more than 9,000 properties scattered across Europe and the Middle East. They had fleets of ships. They controlled trade routes. They managed agricultural lands, mills, vineyards. They were, in every practical sense, a state within states. And that created a tension that only kept growing. Among those who observed that growth with increasing unease was the King of France, a man known as much for his ambition as for his financial troubles, Philip IV, also called Philip the Fair, not for his character, but for his appearance. He was cold, calculating and extremely determined to expand and consolidate the power of the French crown. The kingdom faced serious difficulties. Wars were expensive. The campaign against England had drained the royal coffers. Maintaining control over the internal nobles required constant resources. And while the king struggled to balance his finances, there was an organization within his own territory that seemed to operate with virtually unlimited resources, exempt from taxes and beyond his jurisdiction. The Templars did not answer to the king. They answered directly to the Pope. That meant that inside France, there existed a powerful, well-armed group with more money than the throne and legal immunity guaranteed by Rome. And that was a problem that could not continue indefinitely. But there was something more personal in that equation. Philip IV owed money to the Templars. A considerable sum accumulated over years of loans and financing. And at some point, that debt became not just a financial problem, but a political one. Being indebted to an organization you cannot control is a position of weakness that no king would tolerate for long. So, if paying was not an option, perhaps there was another way out. There is a very old dynamic in situations of power: when you cannot solve a problem directly, you change the narrative around the problem. You don't eliminate the creditor. You turn him into a criminal. And then the debt is no longer a debt. It becomes evidence of complicity. That is how the accusations began to take shape. The process was not quick. And it was not improvised. For some time before 1307, Philip IV and his advisors worked methodically to build a case against the Templars. The central figure in that process was Guillaume de Nogaret, the king's chief jurist and counselor. A man who understood deeply how to use law and narrative to achieve political objectives. The accusations that were formulated were serious and intelligently chosen. Heresy was the most severe of them. In a medieval society, being accused of denying the Christian faith was equivalent to being declared an enemy of the entire social order. It was not just a religious accusation. It was an existential one. But heresy required evidence, or at least something that looked like evidence. And then came the stories about rituals. It was said that during the initiation ceremonies for new members, Templars were forced to deny Christ. To spit on the cross. To engage in acts that went against everything the Christian faith represented. It was said they worshipped a mysterious head called Baphomet, a name that to this day carries enormous symbolic weight, even though its true origin is obscure and disputed by historians. It was said there were inappropriate kisses during ceremonies. Practices that offended the morality of the era. Relationships that contradicted the vows the knights had taken. These were accusations that created vivid images in the mind of anyone who heard them. And that was precisely the point. They did not need to be proven. They needed to be believed. Or at least, they needed to be difficult enough to refute that doubt would linger. And in 1307, Philip IV decided the moment had come. On Friday, October 13, 1307, the order was executed. The king's messengers had been sent out days earlier, carrying sealed instructions. No one knew the contents until the exact moment of action. When the seals were broken, everything happened in perfect synchrony. Think about the level of coordination that required. There were no telephones. No telegraphs. Communications depended on knights carrying physical messages along medieval roads. And yet, in a single morning, hundreds of Templars were arrested across all of France simultaneously. Without warning. Without any chance of reaction. That is not the result of a decision made the night before. That is the product of months, perhaps years, of careful planning. Lists of names. Location maps. Coordination between different regions of the kingdom. A logistical operation of a complexity that, for the era, was extraordinary. And it worked. Within hours, an organization that had taken nearly 2 centuries to build was brought to its knees. But the date chosen carries an additional weight that has never been completely explained. Friday the 13th. Some historians argue that the superstition surrounding this day arose precisely from this event. That the fear of Friday the 13th is not an ancient medieval superstition, but an echo of something that truly happened and became embedded in the collective memory in a way that formal history has never fully captured. Is that true? Hard to say with certainty. But it is an idea that is not easily dismissed. But what came after is even more disturbing. Confessions began to emerge. Not spontaneously, but under pressure. Torture. Prolonged interrogations. Techniques that we now know lead anyone to say whatever is necessary to make the pain stop. The French Inquisition was not known for its gentleness. The methods used during that period included sleep deprivation, food restriction, physical instruments that caused intense and sustained pain. Under such conditions, the question is not whether a person will confess. The question is how long it will take. And suddenly, the stories began to align. The Templars confessed to crimes. They admitted to rituals. They confirmed accusations. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Order himself, confessed. Not once. Multiple times. Confessions he would later retract, then reaffirm, in a cycle that reveals not the truth of a guilty man, but the desperation of someone trying to survive within a system that had already decided his fate. Were those confessions real? Or were they simply the result of a system that needed to justify what had already been done? There is a cruel dynamic in processes like this one. Once the arrest happens, once the accusation is public, there is enormous pressure for guilt to be confirmed. Because if there is no guilt, then what was that mass operation? A monstrous injustice carried out by the king himself? That could not be admitted. The logic of power demanded that the accused be guilty. And the instruments available to ensure that guilt were brutal and effective. The situation quickly drew the attention of the Church. Pope Clement V found himself in a position that could not have been comfortable. On one side, a powerful order under his direct protection, with centuries of service to the Christian cause, whose members screamed their innocence under torture. On the other, a powerful and determined king, with political influence extending far beyond the borders of France, pressing for definitive action. Clement V was not exactly an independent pope. His relationship with Philip IV was complex and, in many ways, unbalanced. The papacy had moved from Rome to Avignon, in France, in 1309, a move that many contemporaries already viewed with suspicion. A pope installed on French territory, in a French city, surrounded by French cardinals, did he have real freedom to defy that same king? Initially, there was resistance. Clement V called for his own investigations. He tried to maintain some form of control over the process. There were bishops and cardinals who questioned the accusations, who defended the Templars, who called for fairer procedures. But the political pressure was too strong. Gradually, control of the situation slipped from the Church's hands and fell entirely into those of the French king. The process against the Templars continued, and the narrative built against them grew increasingly solid, at least officially. And here another intriguing detail emerges. In 2001, the Vatican opened part of its historical archives and revealed a document that became known as the Chinon Parchment. That document showed that Clement V had secretly absolved the Templar leaders of heresy in 1308. In particular, Jacques de Molay himself. Absolved. Secretly. Think about that. The Pope, in private, recognized there was no heresy. But publicly, the process continued. The condemnation happened. The execution happened. The absolution remained hidden for nearly 700 years in a Vatican archive. What does that reveal about the nature of that process? About who was truly in control? And about how many other truths might still be locked away in some archive we will never access? The trials dragged on for years. Some Templars maintained their statements. Others recanted, saying they had confessed under torture. But by that point, it no longer made any difference. The outcome seemed inevitable. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, the Order of the Knights Templar was officially dissolved. Not exactly condemned, the council did not reach a unanimous verdict on the guilt of its members, but extinguished by papal decree. A distinction that some historians consider significant. As though the Church knew there was insufficient evidence for a formal condemnation, but lacked the strength to resist Philip IV pressure enough to issue a public absolution. Their assets were confiscated. Their structures dismantled. And their leaders, condemned. But what happened to those assets is one of the most fascinating and least resolved questions in this entire story. The original plan was for the Templars' properties to be transferred to another military order, the Knights Hospitaller. And part of them were, in fact. But estimates about the true size of the Templar fortune never matched what was actually found and transferred. There was a gap. A discrepancy. Money, gold, documents, artifacts that simply were not there. Where did it go? Among the condemned leaders was Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars. A man who had spent nearly 7 years imprisoned, subjected to interrogations, oscillating between confessions and retractions in a cycle that wears down any human being. On March 18, 1314, he was taken to the Isle of Jews, on the Seine River in Paris. The sentence was life imprisonment, a kind of cruel mercy. But then he did something no one expected. Before a crowd gathered to witness his final humiliation, Jacques de Molay stood up. And withdrew his confessions. He declared publicly that he had lied. That the confessions had been extracted under torture. That the Templars were innocent. And that he would rather die with the truth than live with the lie. Philip IV, furious, ordered his immediate execution. Molay was burned alive that same afternoon, in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And according to accounts from the era, accounts that may be exaggerated, may be apocryphal, but that repeat themselves across different sources, his final words were a summons. A curse, some would say. A warning, others would argue. He reportedly called upon Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to appear before God within a year. Clement V died 33 days later. Philip IV died 8 months after that, the victim of a hunting accident that was never fully explained. Coincidence? Of course it may simply be coincidence. The deaths have documented natural explanations. But the timing is the kind of thing that reason explains and the imagination refuses to entirely accept. And perhaps that is exactly how certain stories survive for centuries. But even with the official end of the order, some questions were never answered. And this is where the official history ends, and the true mystery begins. What happened to the Templars' wealth? Part was confiscated, yes. But many believe that a significant portion simply vanished. Empty coffers. Absent records. Properties that should have contained gold and documents, but that when opened by the king's agents were surprisingly bare. How is that possible? Some historians believe that important documents and considerable assets were discreetly removed in the days before the arrests. That someone within the Templar structure knew what was about to happen. That there was an intelligence network that gave them enough warning to act. If that is true, it raises an immediate question: who knew? And why didn't they warn all members of the order? One possibility is that only the most restricted inner circle was alerted. That the majority of Templars arrested in October of 1307 genuinely knew nothing, not because there was nothing to know, but because they were not considered part of the core that carried the order's deepest secrets. That would imply there was a structure within the structure. A layer of knowledge accessible to very few. And that idea has fueled centuries of speculation about what exactly the Templars may have been guarding. Others suggest that secret routes were already prepared, allowing part of the treasure to be moved to safe locations. There are theories pointing to the Iberian Peninsula, where military orders such as the Order of Christ in Portugal and the Order of Montesa in Spain emerged shortly afterward, possibly inheriting part of the Templar structure, resources and even members. The Order of Christ in particular is fascinating in this context. King Denis of Portugal created this order in 1319, just 7 years after the dissolution of the Templars. And a large portion of the Portuguese Templar Knights was integrated into it. The first Grand Master was Gil Martins, a former Templar. The properties were, in many cases, the same. The structure was similar. Was this a continuation? A deliberate survival disguised as a new creation? And the Order of Christ continued to exist for centuries. Its symbols appeared on the sails of Vasco da Gama's and Pedro Álvares Cabral's ships during the great Portuguese explorations of the 15th century. The Templar cross sailing to Brazil, to India, to Africa. That is more than a curious historical detail. It is a thread connecting the fall of the Templars to the emergence of the modern world. As the years passed, the disappearance of the Templars began to generate something even more powerful than their own existence had generated: myth. And myths, unlike facts, do not require proof. They feed on possibility. On gaps. On unanswered questions. Stories began to circulate at different points in history, some arising shortly after the dissolution, others appearing centuries later. Some said that the Templars had discovered ancient knowledge during the Crusades, texts and teachings that the official church would have considered dangerous or heretical. That the decades spent in Jerusalem, settled in what they believed to be the Temple of Solomon, had given them access to something no one else in Christian Europe possessed. What could that have been? The theories vary enormously. Some speak of documents that would challenge official versions of religious history. Others mention artifacts of immense symbolic or spiritual value. There are those who speak of the Holy Grail, of course, not necessarily a physical chalice, but perhaps something that symbol represented. There are those who speak of the Ark of the Covenant. Of relics. Of texts. None of this has been proven. But also, none of it has been found and definitively dismissed. The absences are what intrigue most. Other stories claim that the Templars had developed, over centuries of financial and diplomatic operation, a network of influence so sophisticated that it survived the formal dissolution of the order. That the members did not simply disappear, but integrated into other structures, other orders, other networks. That the knowledge was preserved, passed from generation to generation through groups that adopted different names but carried the same tradition. This is where history begins to connect to something larger. Because in the centuries that followed, especially from the 18th century onward, Groups like Freemasonry emerged, explicitly invoking the Templar heritage as part of their founding narrative. Some Masonic rituals make direct reference to the destruction of the temple and to the figure of Jacques de Molay. There are degrees in the Masonic hierarchy that bear names and symbolism clearly derived from the Templar universe. Does that prove a direct continuity? Not necessarily. Freemasonry officially emerged in the 18th century and its connections to medieval Templars are disputed by historians. But it is equally impossible to completely dismiss the possibility that traditions, symbols and forms of organization survived in ways that formal records do not capture. And there were those stories suggesting that the true reason behind the Templars' fall was not connected to money or politics. That there was something they knew. Something they had seen. Something they carried. If that is true, then the operation of 1307 was not merely a political action motivated by royal debts and ambition. It was a silencing. A coordinated effort to ensure that certain information never came to light. Not just to eliminate an inconvenient organization, but to erase something. And that would explain something that still puzzles scholars today, the speed and precision with which everything was executed. Think again about the logistics. Nothing about that event looks improvised. The orders were already prepared. The targets were already identified. The accusations were already formulated. The interrogations had scripts. The lists of properties to be confiscated already existed. It was as though everything had been prepared well in advance, waiting only for the right moment to be set in motion. The kind of preparation that goes beyond a political response to an uncomfortable situation. It is the kind of preparation that suggests urgency. That someone, at some point, decided that the Templars needed to be not merely diminished or controlled, but eliminated in a complete and irreversible way. Why act with that urgency? If the goal were simply to resolve a debt, there were other ways. Renegotiation. Gradual confiscation. Reduction of privileges. If it were merely a political conflict over the order's jurisdiction within France, there would have been negotiations with the Pope, agreements, compromises. That kind of dispute between kings and the Church was common and generally resolved with diplomatic patience. But what happened in 1307 does not look like a common dispute. It looks like something more final. A decision made not only about what the Templars were, but about what they knew. About what they carried. About what might surface if they were allowed to continue existing. There is a specific detail that historians rarely highlight, but that deserves attention. In the months preceding the arrests, there was an episode that involved Jacques de Molay directly in conversations about the future of the order. The Grand Master had been summoned to discuss a possible merger between the Templars and the Hospitallers, uniting the two great military orders into a single, more efficient structure. The proposal came from the papacy itself. And Molay was against it. Why? The official history says he resisted for reasons of institutional pride, of preserving the order's identity. But some researchers suggest there was something more. That a merger would mean opening the archives, the documents, the internal practices of the order to an external scrutiny it had never faced before. That there was something within the Templar structure that could not be exposed without consequences. Is that speculation? Yes. But it is well-grounded speculation. Because in the months following that refusal, the arrests happened. Over the centuries, different interpretations have attempted to explain this event. Some are based on rigorously examined historical documents. Others on indirect accounts, oral traditions, texts produced by members of groups claiming to descend from the order. But none manages to fill all the gaps. There is always something that does not fit completely. The most skeptical historians argue, with reason, that the simplest explanation is probably the true one. Philip IV owed money. He needed resources. The Templars were a convenient target. The accusations were fabricated to justify the seizure. And the Pope's hesitance was the result of political pressure, not complicity with something larger. A story of greed, power and injustice. Terrible, but human. Understandable within the logic of the medieval world. And that explanation is solid. It works. It answers most of the questions. But not all of them. It does not fully explain why the Templars' treasure was never found in the expected proportion. It does not explain the Shinon parchment and what it reveals about the papacy's true position. It does not explain the surgical precision of the 1307 operation, which goes beyond what would have been necessary for a simple seizure action. It does not explain the intensity of the accusations, which were specific, detailed and consistent in a way that exceeds what would have been needed to justify a dissolution. And perhaps we will never know. Perhaps the truth was lost with time, buried in archives that will never be fully opened, recorded in documents that did not survive. Or perhaps it was deliberately hidden, by people who understood very well that certain information was more dangerous alive than any armed organization. What is certain is the legacy. And the Templars' legacy is, by any measure, extraordinary. Beyond the myths and the conspiracies, they left concrete contributions that shaped the world we inhabit. The financial system they created was the embryo of what later developed into banks, bills of exchange, credit instruments that are the foundation of the modern economy. The idea of moving value without physically moving money is so fundamental to the contemporary world that we rarely stop to think about where it came from. Templar architecture spread across Europe in a way that is still visible. Round churches, built in reference to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, marked the landscape of countries like Portugal, England, France and Spain. Some of those buildings still exist, are still visited, still carry in their stone blocks the memory of an order that lasted nearly 2 centuries and was destroyed in a single morning. Their cultural impact goes even further. The idea of the knight as a figure who combines physical strength with spiritual and moral commitment, a warrior who serves a purpose greater than himself, is an idea that the Templars helped solidify in the Western imagination. And that archetype has never stopped captivating. It reappears in stories, in films, in books, in games, generation after generation, because it touches something that never runs dry. And then there is, of course, the mystery. The mystery that never closes completely. That always leaves a door slightly ajar for the imagination to enter. If you look only at the official records, you will see an apparently complete narrative. A powerful order was accused, tried and dissolved. An ambitious king destroyed an inconvenient organization. A weak pope allowed justice to be corrupted. A historical injustice that time and distance have made easier to accept. But if you look at the details, the inconsistencies, the questions that remain unanswered after all these centuries, you begin to sense that there is something more. Not necessarily something supernatural. Not necessarily an elaborate conspiracy connecting the Templars to every major event of the centuries that followed. But something. An additional layer that official history cannot fully capture. A dimension of the event that escapes the documents that survived and the accounts that reached us. And perhaps that is exactly what makes this story so impossible to abandon. It offers no resolution. It offers the opposite. The deeper you go, the more questions arise. And that discomfort, that impossibility of closing the case completely, is a mirror of something very real about the nature of history and human memory. Most of the stories that shape the world do not end with a clear explanation. They end with a version that was accepted as definitive out of convenience, out of power, out of the need to move forward. And beneath that version, like sediment beneath a river, there are layers that were never fully excavated. The Templars are an extraordinary example of that. An organization that existed for nearly 200 years, that crossed continents, that shaped finance and battles and architecture and culture, that was destroyed in an operation that still impresses by its precision, and that left behind not an answer, but a field of questions. Fields that we continue to walk through, centuries later, trying to find what was hidden. So now I want to know what you think. Do you believe the Knights Templar were victims of a political and financial game orchestrated by a king drowning in debt and driven by ambition? A story of power, greed and injustice that, as terrible as it is, finds parallels in countless other moments of human history? Or do you think there was something larger behind all of this? Something they discovered. Something they carried. Something that was never meant to be found, and that perhaps still rests somewhere, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. History has answers. But it also has silences. And sometimes, the silences say more than any document. If you enjoy this kind of content, where history and mystery blend in a way that makes you question everything you thought you knew, subscribe to the channel. Because this is just one of the many stories that still hide more than they reveal. And each one of them begins the same way, with a question that seems simple, until you truly start to investigate.